Hi, welcome back to Enrollment Rx's webinar called Reaching New Heights on Salesforce for Admissions. This is our next session where we're going to be talking about how to process and review applications on Salesforce for admissions. My name is Lawrence Levy. I'm the president of Enrollment Rx. We've been a Salesforce ISV partner since 2008, focused on higher education for recruitment and admissions primarily. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague as well, Katie. Katie, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Scanlon. I'm an implementation consultant with Enrollment Rx. I've been with the company for about 2 years. Prior to that, I worked in higher education for about 10 years in different positions within admissions. So I served as an admissions counselor and then also the director of operations. And I'm excited to be giving the demo today.
Great. Thanks for joining us again, Katie. And so for today's session, we just want to go through quickly the agenda. We'd like to cover the common problems of decentralized admissions. What are the typical challenges that colleges and universities are faced with when they're trying to process applications and review and make decisions on applications in what was very often and is very often a decentralized environment with different programs making decisions in different ways for different types of applicants and different reviewer types and so on. So we want to talk about those problems a little bit first, and then we're going to talk about what we did to address those needs. And we developed Reader Rx, so we'll explain what Reader Rx is and how we have solved that for colleges and universities using Salesforce with our product Reader Rx. And we're going to talk about how we, from a processing and decision perspective, how we route applications to the appropriate personnel, how we make determinations of which applications are ready for review, and then as a reviewer, how I can access those applications in some type of queue, what we call those managing of those queues. So we're going to explain that further. We're going to talk about the application evaluation and scoring process. How do we make decisions and the complexity that goes into that? And then once we make those decisions, what happens next from an approval process perspective? Perhaps that's the final decision, or maybe for certain programs or certain applicant types, it has to go through additional rounds of approval. So we'll discuss those kinds of complexity. And when that's all done, really the emphasis, as always, from Enrollment Rx is what skill set is required to configure all of that and make that all work and maintain that and support that. And when changes inevitably are required, again, what skill set's going to be required to make those changes. So we talk about solution composability and the ease of configuration and really empowering those operations folks who are not necessarily software engineers to be able to make the system do all of the kinds of things that they would like to do. So that's our agenda for today. And then, of course, we're going to take questions at the end. So to begin with, to establish the challenge, what are the common problems of decentralized admission? As we've said, I mean, in a university or college environment, if we think about let's just say a graduate school, so there could be 150 different graduate programs. And whether it's nursing or engineering or business, they may be making their admissions decisions 150 different ways, or there's different applicant types, maybe international or domestic, or again, by program, a nursing applicant versus an engineering applicant. The types of documents and materials that have to be provided as part of that application process can be very cumbersome and certainly can be very disorganized in legacy systems. So if you need to then put all of those materials in front of those application decision makers, that can be a very laborious, slow process. And we see that a lot, right? Those disorganized records, not one central system necessarily of all the information you need to review and make a decision on, causes those application decisions to obviously be inefficient. And all of that needs to also take into account the complexity of the unique requirements, which are, again, could be program specific, could be applicant specific, could be reviewer specific. So if somebody's applying to the nursing program versus the business program, the materials they have to submit could be very different. The reviewer that has to score that applicant, the criteria they're scoring that applicant could be very different. And also even the type of reviewer, if I'm a faculty member reviewing and scoring an application versus maybe the dean of the program, maybe the criteria that I have to score that applicant on could be very different. So we need something that can accommodate all of that, right? From where we can, in one centralized environment, create all of the necessary complexity to accommodate all of those unique requirements from program type, applicant type, reviewer type, and then deliver that in a configurable, easy to manage system. So that's why we developed Reader Rx. Reader Rx is our product built on Salesforce, which along with our other products is really what makes Salesforce into that system for recruitment, admissions, and decisions. And so today's demonstration is talking really about what Reader Rx is and how we're leveraging that to do those things. So before I turn it over to Katie, who's going to take us through the demo, I just want to again reemphasize, what are we going to look at? So we're going to start by looking at how do we determine which applications are ready for review? How do we make those decisions? How do we validate that? And then once applications are ready for review, how do we assign them to the appropriate queues? What are queues? If I'm a reviewer who's logging into the system, how do I see which applications are ready for review and access those applications and so forth? So we're going to talk about first what are queues and managing queues and assigning applications appropriately. Once we've looked at that, we're going to talk about the evaluation and scoring process that goes into application reviews. And as we said earlier, all of the materials that get submitted could be different by program type, by applicant type. So how do we determine what criteria we actually even need to be able to review and what is important and what kind of information are we providing as far as on those scoring criteria? And then from there, once an application is reviewed and scored and a decision has been made and we submit that decision, what happens next? Does that go to final decision? Does that go through additional rounds of approval? If that candidate maybe was flagged for a certain criteria, does it have to go through a specialized additional rounds of approval? So how do we manage those approval processes, again, in a very decentralized environment where those requirements could be different from program to program or applicant type to applicant type? So those are the kinds of things that we want to talk about. And then finally, when we've looked at all of that, again, we want to really emphasize the solution composability factor and how easy it is to configure it. Katie's going to give us some examples here today. And I know I'm not saying anything negative about Katie to say that she's not a software engineer, as most of our implementation team are not software engineers, but everything we always show can be implemented and configured by talented people like her who are Salesforce experts and Enrollment Rx experts, but are not trained software engineers by any means. So that is the promise of what we call solution composability. Give me a few minutes, I'll be right back. Let me configure what you need without having to employ an army and a team of software engineers. So with that, Katie, I know you're going to take us through all of those demonstrations, so let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. So what I'm going to be showing initially, I am logged into Salesforce, and I want to show you an application record on the back end of Salesforce initially. So I want to be clear, this is not our reader interface, but I wanted to show it for a few reasons. So one, you can see that there are a lot of fields on this record, a lot of related items, records related to the application itself. And a lot of these fields, they may or may not be needed for the review process or any kind of decision making. So keep that in mind for when I show you the reader review screen. Another reason I wanted to show this record was because Lawrence had mentioned that we leverage native Salesforce approval processes to route applications and to send them to a review process. So that criteria can be as easy as updating a field such as admission status. So I could go to this record, update the admission status to review, meaning it's ready to be sent to the reader review process, make that update, and then that application record will be sitting in the queue that is assigned for the specific program or program level, for example. So I made this update already to this record. So this test record of mine should be sitting in the queue that it's been routed to. So if I go to my assigned applications tab, so the assigned applications tab allows users to view all of the applications that are ready to be reviewed for each of the queues that the user may be a part of. So in the top right-hand corner, we can see the different queues. If I click in the drop-down, so I am part of a graduate queue as well as an undergraduate queue. I also have a queue for just myself if a record has been assigned directly to me. I'm Debbie Director, so I can view applications in that section also. So in this example, Again, we have applications being routed based on program level, so grad versus undergrad. But I want to point out that we have a lot of clients who have a lot of queues. They might have a different review step or review process for all of their programs, meaning that there might be a queue for each individual program. We have some clients who have a different queue for international applicants versus domestic applicants because those requirements are different. And so the review process is different as well. So those are just a couple of examples. So that can be, we can make that as simplified as needed, or we can accommodate those more complex review processes. So what you are looking at in the middle is, again, a list of the applications ready for review. You can see a quick snapshot of important information, such as admission status, academic program. Those columns of information, that's completely customizable for each user. Across the top, users can actually filter applications. If, say, there's a long list of applications ready to be reviewed, they can filter that list based on certain information. If I were to check a box beside one of my applications, here at the bottom, I do have the option to manually reassign that application to another specific user or another queue. So there are use cases where that's helpful to have as well, and you can control who has access to that functionality. Once I'm here, so as a reviewer, I've logged into Salesforce, I've come to my assigned applications tab. I can then choose which individual application I would like to review simply by clicking on our review button here. So when I click on that, what's going to open now is the actual review screen. So I'd like to get everyone oriented to what we're looking at. So on the left-hand side, we have these different what we call review steps. In the middle section, we have details about, so fields for each of those different review steps, depending on which one you've selected. And on the right-hand side, we have the actual review form itself. So let's go into more detail about each of those. So in the middle section here, so I'm in the summary section, you can see fields related to the application. We also have fields down here that are related to the education history of the applicant. So those institutions they've attended previously. So one thing I'd like to point out, so if we think back to that initial application that we saw, obviously there was a lot of fields, a lot of noise. In this reader review screen, you can see that it's a much more consolidated and simplified so that we're only showing reviewers the fields they actually need to see for the review process, which is very helpful, I think, for the reviewer. So you can have as many or as few fields as you'd like on this review screen. These fields can also render dynamically. So based on a certain criteria, for example, if this applicant was an international applicant, we could possibly have additional fields rendering with visa information. But since this is a domestic applicant, those fields aren't needed. So we don't need to show that and clutter the page, right?
So you're saying there that those fields there are actually displaying from multiple related objects? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yep. So it's nice because on one screen, you can have information, so fields from multiple records. So again, the reviewers, they're not jumping from place to place to find that information. It's all on one screen.
So in Salesforce speak, if we were just looking at standard Salesforce user interface, a reviewer might have to jump from different objects to different objects, access all this information, but through Reader Rx, we're able to give them that user interface that consolidates data from all of those related objects into one place for that review.
Yep. So definitely saves a lot of time for the reviewer. They don't have to track down that information. And it's just, again, a user-friendly way to view all of that information at once. So on the next review step, so let's go to the education history review step just to point out a few things. What you're going to be looking at is in a second is this is a list of education history records associated with the application. So we can see the institutions they've attended previously. These columns of information can be customized and show information that's important for the reviewer. You can also see if the files, so transcripts, have been uploaded as well. If I were to click into one of these records, you can actually see more details about the record itself. You can see the files down here available for annotation. So I did want to briefly show our annotation feature. So if I click on the transcript, this opens the annotation feature where reviewers can actually, if needed, they can kind of mark up and make annotations to the transcript record itself, and they can save those annotations directly within the reader product. Again, they're not having to go elsewhere to do that function. Another thing that reviewers can do directly from the screen is if they click on this pencil icon in the top right, they can actually edit that specific record directly from the reader interface as well. So maybe they need to, make an adjustment to the GPA, or they need to change the document status or input additional information. That could be done directly from the record. Again, directly from the reader interface. Again, without having to navigate away from reader to track down, those records in Salesforce. So again, saves a lot of time. Another thing I'd like to show, so let's go to the admissions documents. So again, this will be a list of admissions requirements that are related to the application. So some have been waived, some have been received. So at a quick glance, reviewers can see the status of those. They can click into those again to see that information. Another thing that can be done is any page that has this plus sign, which can be added to any of the review steps. Reviewers can actually create a new record directly from the reader interface. So a use case for this might be that, during the review process, it's determined that another, a resume is required. So additional, supplemental documents are required for the review process. That document can be added directly from this page. So if I want to add a resume, I can create that record directly in Reader. And then that record now shows in the list on the admissions documents. So that's a helpful feature as well. So let's go over to our review form. So similar to the information in the middle section, this information that's rendering can render dynamically. We have fields that can show dynamically as well. For example, if we select yes for, say, extracurricular involvement, a field will populate where reviewers can enter the activity information. Again, so they're only seeing fields that they need to see. You can make fields required, and you can also add instructional text that might be helpful for your reviewers. These review forms can be different for every queue or review step that we have set up for you. So in this example, we have our undergraduate review form. And so we're asking questions like academic rating, yield potential, extracurricular involvement. If I were to go over to my other example, so in this example, this is a graduate level applicant applying to a master's in nursing program. In our graduate review form, you can see it is different. We're asking questions such as like quality of work experience. So I just wanted to point out that those evaluation forms can differ, again, depending on what review step and what actual process the application is in. So I'm going to go back to my undergrad review form. So I wanted to show at the bottom of this section, reviewers can save using this button. So they can start filling out the form, save this, and then come back to it later without submitting the decision. They can generate a zip file using this button, and that will create a zip file including all of the application information, related record information, as well as any documents that have been uploaded, such as transcripts. So it's a nice way to quickly generate that file. This button is our submit button. So with the submit button, what that does is it does save all of our responses in what's called an application feedback record. And basically that's just a log, so a history of responses and reviewers for the specific application. A few things can happen when I click the submit button. So either that final decision can be made. So maybe it's just a one-step process where I've admitted the applicant and the decision is done and they're no longer in the review process. I could submit this and it could go automatically to another step. So maybe the first step is an admissions review, and the next step might be a director of admissions review, or possibly a dean or division chair. That could be the next step in the process. We do have some clients who choose to have a manual step. So if they click the submit button, maybe there's optionally another manual review step they would like to send it to another user or queue. For this record, we can fill this out. And in this example, I'm going to make this my final admissions decision so that once I make this decision, the admission status on the application record is going to be updated and it's no longer in a review process. If I did want to send it for additional review, I could easily check this box, which would then send it to another review step. But we're not going to do that for this demonstration today. So if I submit the button, we're going to go back to that original application record I showed. So if you remember, the admission status was review. So if I refresh this record, if I scroll down, you can see that my admission status for this record is now admit. So that decision has been made. So that's an example of how that one step, simplified review process can take place. Quickly, if I click on this feedback section, you can see the application feedback record that was saved. So that was my responses in that review form. We've talked a lot about, different steps and routing. So I wanted to show quickly the backend approval process that Lawrence mentioned earlier. I don't want to get too technical, but I think it's important to see this. So on the backend, so I'm in the setup section of Salesforce. So this is the undergraduate approval process. So the process that my application record just went through. This is where entry criteria, so that routing to send it to the review process itself, this is where that can be set up. So it can be based on a field such as admission status equaling review, as in my example. If I scroll down, you can see the approval steps. You can see step 1, which is that process, that step we just went through. And then we see the optional step 2, where if I had selected send for additional review, if I had checked that box, it would have gone to that next step. So when Lawrence was talking about being able to add different steps and edit the criteria, this is something that even though it seems technical, it's something that an admin is able to do for sure.
Can you give us some examples of what are some normal different types of approval steps that clients might have in a real world example? I mean, here we have undergrad and grad as one example, but what are the common ones that you encounter?
Yeah, so I had mentioned that sometimes we see clients that have different steps for each program. So even though there might be one undergraduate process, there might be a step for each individual program. So it's being routed to each queue for each program. We have some clients who have multiple steps related to, I mentioned the example of international applicants. So an example of that would be, there might be like an initial admissions review, and then there might be a next step that is an international student affairs person that's reviewing it. And then there might be another step where a final decision is made. So we see a lot of multi-step programs or multi-step programs. So those would be a few examples, but we see a lot by program. I think that's a common one for sure.
Right. And that logic, those approval processes, they're configured here in the Salesforce approval process setup. That's what we're leveraging for that.
Yep. Yeah. So this is native Salesforce. So that's what we're leveraging for routing our applications. And in this approval process, just to point out, this is also where the queues or individual users are assigned to the specific steps. So this is also where that's controlled. So with that, since we're kind of speaking more on the setup side of things, if I go to my next screen here, I wanted to quickly show this Reader RX setup tab that we have. So this is where all of the Reader Rx configuration can be done essentially all in one place. So I don't want to go through each of these different items, but I think it's important to know kind of what can be controlled here. So this is where we can control permissions. So access to that reader interface. That's where we control permissions for queues and the users within those queues. This is also where we can configure those columns of fields on that initial queue screen where you can see the list of applications. This is also where you can access your review steps and evaluation forms and make edits. So all of that is done in this setup tab. And I think, the main takeaway from that is it is a user-friendly way to kind of take care of all of that in one place. So it's easy for clients to maintain moving forward after the initial implementation. So with that, let's go to the application review steps. So again, these are the review steps. These can be edited from this screen as well. This is also where you can access your evaluation forms themselves. We have our graduate and undergrad forms here. If I click on this pencil icon, I can actually access the form and make edits. So what we're doing here is we're leveraging our form builder functionality to create our review forms as well as those review step pages. But I'm not going to go through a complete walkthrough of how to make, a ton of edits to this, but I wanted to show that it can be a very simple edit as far as like dragging and dropping a field onto the form. So let's say in the example for the graduate review process, an interview is now required for part of that process, and we need a field on the evaluation form related to interviews. So I can come over here and I can select my interview rating field and just simply drag it onto the page. If I click into this field, which I'm not going to do a full overview of this either, but I think it's important to know that clicking into this field, this is where I can control things like having it render dynamically, making it required versus not required. If there's any kind of instructional text to help out the reviewers, that can be added here as well. And I want to point out that, again, these fields are what we have set up in our Salesforce org for demonstration purposes, but all of these fields exist on that application feedback record I had mentioned, and these are completely customizable as well. So if I save my change, so I've saved my grad review form. If I actually go back to my test record, so this is my graduate review form, my graduate test record I showed earlier. If I were to refresh this page, we'll now be able to see the new interview rating field that was added. So a very quick update, very easy to do and easy to maintain for clients.
That was a great quick overview, and we will have some follow-up questions, I know, in just a minute. But you really did show us there how a reviewer is able to access all of the appropriate information that they should need out of Salesforce that's living in all of those different records, and then how they can even edit or update those pieces of data from that user interface, I think is what you're showing us there, right, Katie? Is that those users also can be empowered to input or edit information, as well as even add additional admissions requirements, checklist items, as we call them, but make additional documents required and so on. And then annotate those documents, score those applications in a very complex fashion, accommodating all of those very unique requirements that we've seen in the 16 years that we've been doing this, and do it all in a composable fashion. So it was a great overview. Of course, we could speak all day on this. I know we can. So there's so much more we could show and would show, but that's just a very quick overview of that. So if you'd like more information on that, of course, please do reach out to us. With that, we do want to remind everybody that we have additional sessions coming up for future Wednesdays. So next Wednesday, February 14th, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into what we call the click and buy experience for non-traditional programs. So what is that applicant portal experience, or what is that applicant experience for those adult learners, continuing education programs, dual enrollment programs, where it's not that traditional apply and submit your application. It's more of a browse online and sign up and register for a course and make a payment. So we'll talk about how we facilitate that. And then the week after, we're going to talk about managing events on Salesforce for recruitment and admissions and all of the complexities therein. The following week, we're focusing on data for recruitments and admissions, creating the proper reports and dashboards for those best practices around analytics. And then the week after, we're talking about CRM and SAS integration, how does Salesforce and Banner or Colleague or Genzabar or PeopleSoft or what have you, how do they all integrate? And what does that need to look like? And then to wrap up the series, we're going to talk about preparing for an implementation and all of the considerations and best practices around that. So please do join us for those upcoming sessions. They're available on our website. You can register for those there at enrollmentrx.com. And with that, Katie, let me see what questions we have in the question box. And the first question is, can an application be reviewed again once it has already been reviewed? So that's actually a great question. That's a common question we get a lot, Katie. So what happens when an application has already been reviewed, and how do we address that normally?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we actually have had several clients set up a reevaluation process. So we definitely can accommodate that. My use case is, sometimes maybe a record has been conditionally admitted and then the admissions office, they receive updated transcripts. So it can then be sent back for reevaluation to review those updated transcripts, make those annotations, and possibly change that admissions decision to fully admit, for example. So that's something we can definitely accommodate. And there's some examples where the same reviewer has to review the record more than once. So it has to be the same, maybe deputy director is reviewing more than once, and we can accommodate that as well.
Excellent. Thank you. There's a question here that I know we did already talk about, but so just to reconfirm, someone's asking, can the reviewers really edit the records and create new requirements? So again, Katie, I know I just talked about, but if you want to just reemphasize.
Yeah. So that was that in the demonstration, that plus sign icon for any of the review set pages. If that plus sign icon is there, you can create a record. So the example I showed was creating that resume record. So that can be definitely done. And also the edit feature with that pencil icon, if it exists on the review step page, you can edit the records directly from Reader as well.
And is that something that you can also control through governance, through permissions, that if you
Yes,
don't?
Yeah. Sometimes maybe we don't want the reviewers to edit any records, and we can remove that button for sure.
Right. There's one more question here, which is what type of Salesforce license is necessary to support the reviewer users? So I'm happy to answer that question. I mean, of course, we're built on Salesforce. Everything Katie showed here today is Salesforce. We've never left Salesforce. It's just the user interface that we're delivering here from our product, but it's all in and on Salesforce. So every one of those users would need a Salesforce license of some type in order to authenticate, to log into Salesforce and access this data. Very often, application reviewers might be, irregular Salesforce users. They might only be logging in to review and score applications. It might be like faculty members even that are not full-time admissions staff. They're just logging in, once a month per year to review and score applications. So in order to accommodate that level of extreme, the minimum viable license that a user like that would need would be called a Salesforce Lightning Platform Starter license, is what it's called. The Lightning Platform Starter LPS license is the minimum viable user license that a Reader Rx user would need in order to read, review, and score applications. Now, of course, if a user happens to have a higher level license than that from Salesforce, a CRM license, a full CRM license, they also could certainly use Reader Rx as well. But the minimum Salesforce user license for a Reader Rx user would be an LPS license, a Lightning Platform Starter license. So that's a great question as well. That seems to be all the questions for today. So with that, I'll say thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Please join us again next week. And thank you so much, Katie, for helping us this week, and as well to our colleague, Audrey, who's always on the call and doesn't get to say too much, but puts a fortunate amount of effort into producing these things every week. So thank you, Audrey, as well. Thank you so much.